Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Lida Teneva. I serve as the Science Director for the California Ocean Science Trust. I want to begin this webinar, this briefing, by acknowledging that here in Sacramento, we're on the tribal lands of the Nisenan people. I'd like to extend my welcome to all of you to our Ask an Expert briefing on offshore wind energy for California. This is presented in partnership with the California Council on Science and Technology and Assemblymember Chiu. Ocean Science Trust is a nonprofit organization dedicated to convening science expertise to accelerate progress towards a healthy, equitable, and productive coast and ocean. This briefing is part of our new science services program for the California legislature specifically. And for more information on this, feel free to sign up for our newsletter to get notices about events like this. And please visit our website. I believe my colleagues are going to be putting some more details about that in the chat. We have a great panel of experts today. We've planned plenty of time for Q&A. Please ask your questions using the Q&A feature in Zoom rather than the chat. We'll also have a technical summary two-pager to share with all of you today on this topic following the briefing. So you'll have the equivalent of a handout equivalent to an in-person briefing like this. And with that, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Jordan Diamond. Jordan Diamond is the Executive Director of the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment at UC Berkeley School of Law. She has worked on a variety of ocean policy issues and recently has been involved in offshore wind energy issues for California. Jordan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Lida. First and foremost, I want to thank everyone at Cal OST and CCST for convening today's briefing. As Lida said, I'm Jordan Diamond, the head of the Center for Law, Energy, and Environment at UC Berkeley. I should also note for disclosure, I am a public member of the California Ocean Protection Council appointed by former Governor Brown back in 2018. But do please note that none of my remarks should be attributed to OPSB or to the University of California. I'm speaking personally in my own stead. So it is a delight to moderate today's discussion around what I think is a pivotal topic at the intersection of our energy and climate future and our oceans, especially in the wake of the release of the IPCC's latest findings just days ago. We know there is an increasing urgency to our climate actions. While the second largest fire in California's history is raging on, while we're trying to sustain through a mega drought that threatens lives and livelihoods. We also know that our oceans are not, in fact, infinite, as was thought not as recently as last century. And we're also experiencing extraordinary technical innovation that is making what we once thought impossible, potentially possible. So all of this comes together in this arena when we focus on the prospect of offshore wind, or more specifically, floating offshore wind off of California's coast. So today's session is intended to help bring clarity to some of the scientific and technical knowns and unknowns related to this nascent industry. When they asked me to moderate, I asked me to start with a high-level overview of where things stand with regard to offshore wind development in California for anyone that's just beginning to explore the case. And I'll note at the outset, if that is the case, my team at UC Berkeley recently issued a report entitled Envisioning Offshore Wind for California that provides an overview of the associated challenges and opportunities and suggests priority actions to ensure a comprehensive strategic approach to this new to California industry. Our report built from input provided at 2 workshops from a wide range of participants, and the findings center around suggestions for how California can engage in a planning process that will set a gold standard, both domestically and internationally, for offshore wind development, specifically floating. A planning process that emphasizes smart, equitable planning and ensures inclusive engagement, the development of co-benefit goals, creating shared data, standards, and systems, et cetera. But back to the context for where things stand right now. At present, in the United States, there are 2 offshore wind projects operating. They're both on the East Coast. We have Rhode Island's 30-megawatt Block Island Wind Farm, which started operating back in 2016, and the 12-megawatt Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Project started operating last year. 16 other leases have been issued by the Interior Department's Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, but no leases to date have been issued on the West Coast, which was long thought to be too deep for offshore wind. But that changed when the first proposal to develop floating offshore wind came forth. Back in 2016, then Trident Wind expressed interest in developing floating offshore wind off of Morro Bay. This officially triggered BOEM's offshore wind planning process in California. In 2018, another unsolicited lease request was submitted by the Redwood Coast Energy Authority for an area offshore of Humboldt. By October of that year, BOEM issued calls for information and nominations for the Morro Bay area, the Humboldt Bay area, and a third area off of Diablo Canyon. They received numerous expressions of interest in response. This year, several notable things have happened, beginning with the Biden administration's proclamation of a 30 gigawatt goal for offshore wind by 2030. They issued that proclamation back in March. That was followed in May by the Biden administration and the state of California jointly announcing their intent to advance offshore wind planning in two of the call areas, the 399 Morro Bay area, as it's called, which has been modified from the original proposal, and an as of then not delineated Humboldt Bay area. Just 2 weeks ago, BOEM officially moved forward and published a call for information and nomination for two new areas within the 399 Morro Bay area and formally designated the Humboldt Wind Energy Area and is going to proceed with environmental review. And just yesterday, Secretary Holland and CEQ Chair Brenda Mallory joined Representative Jerry Huffman, California Energy Commission Commissioner Karen Douglas, and tribal leaders and other community officials to discuss offshore wind opportunities. That discussion took place in Eureka. That is where things stand. There have been no leases for offshore wind issued in California. The first lease auction is generally anticipated to take place in the first part of next year. After that, if leases are issued, there will be several years of submission and review of plans, including the Site Assessment Plan, or SAP, and a Construction and Operation Plan, or COP, before build begins. With that, we now leave behind the context portion of today's discussion, as this is not a policy discussion, and rather we turn to the world of the science and technology behind floating offshore wind. And for that, I am delighted to be joined by a remarkable panel of experts. First, we'll hear from Dr. Arne Jacobson, the director of Schatz Energy Research Center at Humboldt State University. He'll be today's expert on the energy potential for offshore wind. Second, we'll hear from Dr. Ben Ruttenberg, the director of the Center for Coastal and Marine Sciences at Cal Poly, who will be today's expert on understanding the interaction between fisheries and potential offshore wind operations. And third, we'll hear from Dr. Andrea Copping, a senior researcher at the Pacific Northwest National Lab, or PNNL, where she focuses on marine renewable energy and offshore wind development. She is today's expert on potential environmental impacts and wildlife impacts from offshore wind operations, as well as lessons learned from offshore wind in Europe. Right. So without further ado, Arne, it's a pleasure to turn things over to you first.
Thank you very much, Jordan, and really a pleasure to be here with all of you today. I'm going to share my screen briefly and just show a couple of slides. I'll focus on presenting at a high level just some of the geography and a brief overview of the technology associated with offshore wind. As I mentioned, I'm director of the Schatz Energy Research Center at Humboldt State University, and for the last several years, our team has been involved in research related to the feasibility of offshore wind here on California's North Coast. And the link that's shown on the screen here is one that provides goes to a page that provides additional information related to some of the findings of that work. As has been mentioned, California's offshore wind resource is very large and has great potential to contribute substantially to the state's clean energy and climate goals. It's estimated from some of the areas that could be feasibly pursued that up to an estimated 16 gigawatts of installed capacity could be deployed across multiple offshore wind farms. As a point of reference, California currently has 80 gigawatts approximately of total in-state installed capacity. So 16 gigawatts of offshore wind would be a fairly significant fraction of the state's generation portfolio if that were to be fully developed. In terms of geography, Jordan had mentioned several call areas. The two that BOEM has initiated processes for are the Humboldt call area, which is shown towards the top of the screen, and the Morro Bay 399 call area, which is shown here more towards the middle. The Humboldt call area is about 20 miles from shore. It starts about 20 miles from shore and goes out to about 30 miles from shore. And if fully developed, could have an installed capacity of something on the order of 1.6 gigawatts. The Morro Bay 399 call area is also roughly 20 miles from shore at the closest point, maybe slightly closer, and goes out to something on the order of 30 miles from shore at its furthest point, and could have an installed capacity of up to about 3 gigawatts. In terms of technologies, there are, of course, multiple ways of installing offshore wind systems, including fixed bottom and floating platform systems. The turbines themselves are conventional, very much like the turbines that are used in land-based wind farms. And so really the differences have to do primarily with how they're deployed or how they're mounted. On the West Coast, because of the deep waters, floating platforms would be needed. And this is very much an emerging technology. Less than 1% of global offshore wind capacity uses the floating platform approach. Nearly all of the installed systems are fixed bottom, but that technology would not be appropriate given the deep waters off the California coast. In terms of size, these systems are very large. The example that I'm showing here is for a 12 megawatt turbine, and the hub, meaning this point here in the middle, would be about 450 feet above the ocean surface, and with the blades to the top of a blade, it might be 850 to 900 feet above the ocean surface. And for scale, we've included a humpback whale in the image, which is about 43 feet long. So you can see that these are very large machines. And in terms of how they would be laid out in the ocean, there might be a mile or more of separation between the floating platforms to avoid having the wake from one turbine interfere with the available wind at the next turbine. And then below the surface, there would be mooring lines that go down to the bottom so that the systems are anchored, as well as electrical cables. In between the machines, they would likely float at a depth of a few hundred feet. And then there additionally would be an export cable that would bring power to shore. And then I guess the final point that I'll make here is that it's important to think not just about the offshore portion of these systems. There are also very important onshore elements to the systems as well, including port infrastructure associated with deployment of the systems, as well as operations and maintenance, and then onshore transmission equipment. And so when thinking about these systems, it's important to think about all of those elements when we're considering environmental impacts, when we're considering community benefits and community concerns, as well as just the physical infrastructure. All of those pieces are important. I will stop there for now, but I'd be happy to particularly answer questions related to infrastructure needs and technology and potential in the once we get to that part of the panel.
Thank you very much, Arne. And moving next to Ben.
Thanks, Jordan. Thanks, Arne, Andrea, and everyone else for participating, and for Cal OST for hosting this important discussion. I'm going to spare everyone the slides and just talk a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing down here at Cal Poly mostly focused on the Central Coast, the Morro Bay Call area, the Diablo Canyon Call area, and then some of our fisheries work has been statewide. Our lab has started working on this about 5 or 6 years ago, starting to evaluate the potential energy production of offshore wind with an emphasis on the Central Coast and our region. And one of the things that we found is that the potential for, there seems to be great potential for offshore wind to complement other renewable energies, that the wind speeds and then the power production tend to pick up in the late afternoon and early evening, especially in the spring and summer, which is right when demand spikes. As people, well, back in the day when we used to go to work and come home from work, we'd all get home, turn our appliances on, there'd be this spike in electricity demand. That offshore wind production tends to increase right around that time, conveniently right around the time that solar production, as the sun starts to go down, solar production starts to wane. So that was one of our first key findings, was that there seems to be a pretty good match, seems to be very complementary to some of these other renewable energy sources that we know we're going to need to meet California's aggressive renewable energy goals. We've also then pivoted to start looking at the impacts of fisheries and really starting to think about siting, where these things are going to go. So we've been analyzing several different fishery data sets, including some state landings data, as well as some NOAA spatial data, combining these things together to get a sense of where fishing activity is happening. And some of the more recent work that our group is doing right now, thinking about trade-off analysis. Are there ways that we can find places in the ocean where this power production is high, where it's really windy at the right times, and where fishing activity and potentially other activities, things like marine mammal activity, seabird density, shipping, other users of ocean space, where those activities are low. Basically trying to find the win-wins where power production is high and the potential impacts to these other things are likely to be low. That's kind of where our work has focused recently. And again, the fisheries work has been statewide, and a lot of the other work has been local. I'll turn it back to you, Jordan.
Thank you, Ben. And last but certainly not least, Andrea.
Thanks so much, Jordan. And thank you to all of you for organizing this panel. I'm really pleased to be here today to be able to speak with you. My name is Andrea Copping. I'm a senior research scientist at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, as Jordan said. That is one of the US Department of Energy's national labs, and we're located up in Washington State. I'm also a distinguished faculty fellow at the School of Marine and Environmental Affairs at the University of Washington. I'm a PhD in biological oceanography, but I came to this energy stuff somewhat later. And I've been working on environmental effects of offshore renewable energy for about the last 11 or 12 years. I've studied offshore wind effects for the Department of Energy, also for BOEM and NOAA, and I've been fortunate enough to be able to interact and work with a number of the floating offshore wind developers to try to sort of understand their side of things too. In addition to that, I've been really lucky to have led 2 international programs among nations who have interests in environmental effects of wind and marine energy. And this has really given us a chance to learn from other countries' experiences and to share our own. So before I get into what we know and don't know about environmental effects of floating offshore wind, I'd just like to make one point, if you'll indulge me. I want us to think about the fact that the plants, marine plants and animals, the oceanographic conditions, and the ecosystem processes that we're concerned about are going to suffer greatly more under climate change scenarios than from any offshore wind effects. We think of rising ocean temperatures, of ocean acidification, shifts in winds and currents and waves. These will all place enormous tolls on marine life that we know. And with these changes, fisheries catches won't be the same, and other ocean uses will change as well. So we have a lot to learn about the potential effects of floating offshore wind, but we do know a good deal, and we can deduce even more from other offshore industries. We've learned a great deal from bottom-mounted offshore wind around the world and the small number of floating installations that are in the UK, in Japan, and so on. And we've also learned from other offshore industries like marine energy and also oil and gas. So my work for the National Lab has been mostly around determining the relative risk to marine resources in the ocean from offshore renewables. Specifically, what parts of a system are likely to cause risk to what animals or habitats or processes. I then work with a large group to develop research that can help elucidate those risks better. My group at PNNL has spent a good deal of time the last couple of years gathering data to help to retire some of those risks. That is, look at the risks that are very low or too insignificant, where they don't need to be investigated at every new project, and put them aside so that the collective community can concentrate our time and resources on those risks that are really still very uncertain and that may be highly significant. So what do I think those risks are? In a very sort of simplistic way, right now, I consider the most important risks from floating offshore wind to be collision of seabirds with turbine blades. We know that seabirds, can be at risk, but we also have evidence that their risk is lower than that of their land-based or their terrestrial bird counterparts. And we believe this is because seabirds are better at flying around large storm systems. They seem to have better capacity than the land-based birds. It's important to note that in some offshore locations, there may also be risk to bat species from collision with turbine blades. However, on the West Coast, this is really pretty limited to where bats are commuting from the mainland out to islands and back. A bat that flies due west of the straight coastline in the West Coast is not going to fare well. So they're really not a prevalent risk there. We also think there may be some interruptions in migration routes for some marine animals, sea turtles, baleen whales, but we really don't know enough to speculate on how severe this might be. We really haven't had anything like lines of offshore wind turbines off coastlines like this to make those determinations. The same is true for the very often mentioned concern of whales encountering mooring lines and cables and perhaps become entangled. Again, we know little from the field. We have done some modeling and some other work, and this appears partly the scale. You'll remember that Arne showed how tiny the whale is and how large these systems are, how much sea room there is. We believe this to be a very low risk, but we won't know till we actually get out there. There's other concerns that are raised that we think can be dealt with. Noise from the turbines. This may affect some bird species. The vast majority of that noise will not penetrate the ocean environment. The loss from air to water is about 90% of the sound. So there's unlikely to be very much underwater sound interrupting marine mammals or certain fish species. Electromagnetic fields from power cables. We have in recent years investigated a good deal of this. It's something to be watched, but can be mitigated. Changes in seafloor habitats from putting down anchors and lines and so on. Again, we don't see these as huge risks and they can all be mitigated. So with that, I want to stop because I could go on for hours. And with my colleagues, I'm really looking forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Following those opening comments, we now move to Q&A. So as a reminder, as you're seeing the notes, please go ahead and if you can submit your question via the Q&A platform. If that's not working for you for any reason, go ahead and just send it by chat function. And of course, just let us know if neither of those are working for you. The first question that I would love to present to all of you from Assemblymember Chiu's office. How can offshore wind contribute to California's climate goals, and what are the potential benefits of incorporating offshore wind into the state's renewable energy portfolio? So Arne, maybe we could start with you.
Sure, happy to respond to that. I think there's several different dimensions to this. One is that the offshore wind resources is offshore from California is quite a significant resource. And so there is very good potential for renewable energy generation from these systems. I think it's useful to compare the productivity of offshore wind systems with what you might expect from onshore wind systems or from solar-based renewable energy generation systems, because that gives you a sense of comparison. And so a metric that we often use is what's called the capacity factor. And that's just the relationship between the installed capacity and what fraction of that installed capacity can you expect to generate on average from that system. And for offshore wind systems along the California coast, there are many locations where we would expect that capacity factor to be 50% or slightly above 50%, which is quite high. Typically for land-based wind systems, that number is on the order of 30 to 40%, and for solar, typically 15 to 30%. And so for each megawatt of installed capacity for offshore wind, you're getting more energy generation. And so that's one way that it contributes. I think a second important dimension has to do with the time of day and the time of year that that generation occurs. And on average, offshore wind generation is relatively consistent over the course of the day. Although there are seasonal differences in generation, those seasonal differences are not as large as they are with some other renewable energy technologies. And so even in the wintertime, when perhaps the wind is slightly lower than it is in the spring and summer, the generation is quite significant. And so that complements generation from solar quite well. Of course, offshore wind is still an intermittent technology, so there will be periods when there is no generation, just because there are times of calm, but it complements solar generation and onshore wind quite well. And so it can help be part of a portfolio that supports California's goal of achieving 100% clean energy by 2045.
Thank you, Arne. Andrea or Ben, did you have anything to add on? That's a pretty comprehensive response.
It was, and I think Ben made the point earlier that the beauty on a daily basis of being able to augment the solar as it drops at night, and then also be able to get that afternoon hump is one of the biggest things that all the West Coast states are looking at. How do you get over the so-called duck curve where you have that big drop in the middle? Great answer.
Great, thank you, Andrea. The next question, and this consolidates a few questions that we received on the fisheries side, but what are the predicted impacts on fisheries, if any, and how do we determine them? What are and the second part of that would be, what are typical mitigation measures for any anticipated impacts? And Ben, if we could start with you.
Yeah, those are great questions, and this sort of been the focus of a lot of the work that we've been doing over the last year and a half or more. The most likely impacts are simply going to be an area where there's a wind farm, and as Arne showed, there's going to be a lot of cables and anchors and things in the water. It's going to be really hard to drag fishing gear through that. So these areas are likely going to turn into some sort of de facto closed area, or at least closed to certain types of fisheries. And so that type of fishing activity is likely going to be restricted inside those areas. And so that's certainly going to be the biggest impact, is just that this area where these wind farms are in a static place is going to be, become some sort of a de facto NPA with some restrictions on fishing activity. Again, part of some of the work that we're doing is trying to find places where the wind is strong, the power production potential is very high, and that fishing activity is low, to essentially minimize the potential impact of those fisheries out of the gate, right? So that's one of the big emphasis of the work that we're doing, is trying to find those places that have that high production and have less fishing activity. Mitigation is obviously going to be somewhat challenging. Some of it simply might be, fishing is an industry, it is an economic activity, and so some of that mitigation might simply be compensating the fishing community in some way. And there are to cooperative fishing organizations that help provide support for fishing activities, new infrastructure, things like this. There's lots of different ways to do it, and certainly I would not even start by suggesting what the right approach is in a given community. It's all going to be about what that community needs. Yeah, so that's really the primary impact is simply going to be loss of that fishing, and I would guess that the primary mitigation is simply going to be compensation.
Jordan, if I could just add to that a little, we've just looked at this off the Washington coast actually, and I think location is what matters. As Arne pointed out, these wind farms, the call areas, and that's just the edge of the call area, not necessarily where there will be a wind turbine. The entire call area will not be covered in wind turbines, it'll be somewhere within there. The closest to shore is about 20 miles off. So we need to really think about, we're talking more about offshore fisheries, not coastal fisheries, not crabbing, not recreational fisheries. At least I don't think many people are going out there with a hook and line 20 miles out. So I think that really looking at the specifics of what fisheries we're talking about, in many of the offshore fisheries, as you know, they may be very long, almost half continent coastal fisheries or offshore fisheries. So being able to really have a dialogue with the fishing community and the larger fishing companies of what the appropriate locations are, I think that it can end up without being a lose for anyone. It's simply a matter of figuring out where those best areas are and having everyone at the table as you have that discussion.
Let me just add one more thing that, oh, sorry, go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, I was just going to note in Europe, just to underscore the whole fisheries thing, the greatest number of insurance claims around offshore wind in Europe is to the damage to the cables that have been dragged up by fishing. And in the UK and several parts of the north, other Belgium, Netherlands, and so on, they initially allowed fishing, including dredging, among the wind farms, and they've stopped that for that reason. So while hook and line and sort of shallow fishing is certainly possible, I agree with Ben. These are likely to be no-go areas among the fishing, among the actual turbines, to protect the fishing community as well as the wind farms.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that as Andrea mentioned, it's really certain fisheries are going to be much more impacted than others. So off of the coast of California, the primary fisheries that are going to be impacted are going to be groundfish. So things like sablefish, some of the soles, some of the deep water rockfish. Those are the things that are really going to be primary. Those are the fisheries that are going to be impacted by these closures. As Andrew mentioned, most of the crab fishing and the recreational fishing is happening well inshore, much closer to shore, nowhere near these areas. And so those fisheries are likely to be, have very, very minor, if any, impacts at all. And so it's really being careful about what sorts of fisheries we're talking about. Again, that's the emphasis of our work so far.
Thank you both. Since we're talking about groundfish and the seafloor impacts, there was one clarification from Mike Okoniewski from Pacific Seafood. Mike asked, what is the scope of the anchor system? So if you could maybe just give a little more clarity as we're talking about that, what is the anchoring system looking like? And I should say, what is it most likely looking like?
I guess I'll just start by saying that there are multiple different types of mooring systems and multiple different types of anchoring systems. And so it's hard to describe all of them in detail, certainly, but the anchoring systems that are selected are going to be a function of both the composition of the seafloor and also the mooring system that is used for a particular system. So we don't know yet exactly which types of mooring and anchoring systems will be used, because that will be a function of how wind developers design those particular systems. So I'll just start by saying that. In terms of the anchors themselves and the footprint on the ocean floor will be considerably smaller than you would expect for in terms of where the individual anchors are, than you would expect for the fixed bottom foundations that are associated with offshore wind systems in shallower water that are the ones that are more commonly used around the world at this stage. The overall footprint in terms of the area that is encompassed by the anchoring system or the mooring system is quite large, of course, but the actual anchor points are a small fraction of that area. Andrea, I don't know if you have anything you want to add related to that in relationship to some of the environmental dimensions.
Not really. I mean, Arne's right. You don't know what it'll look like till they design it. But to give you just a little mental picture, and Arne had a slide earlier, there are what's known as tension leg moorings where they go almost straight down from the platform themselves. But the more common are the catenary moorings that go out a ways. But Arne is correct that in soft sediment, which is most of what's that distance off the California coast, they use very large embedment anchors that basically go right into the bottom. So what you see after installation is a mooring line connected to a large shackle. So there may be some disturbance putting in the anchors, but afterwards the actual footprint of each anchor is really quite small. Agreed.
Thank you both. And one more question on the kind of fishing impact side, and this is from Steve Scheiblower, but we've been talking about how location matters and figuring out where minimal impacts of fishing would be, but that obviously depends, those determinations depend on what data is being used. So Ben, could you maybe start, and Andrew, if you want to join in, but discussing what sort of data about fishing basically is being relied on at this stage?
Yeah, that's another great question. And obviously the data that you're using for your analysis is hugely important, because if you're using data sets that are only partially complete, you're only going to get a partial answer. And so, what we've been doing so far at Cal Poly is primarily focusing on two data sets. One is the California landings data. Every time a commercial vessel lands, catch in a port, they're required to file essentially a fish ticket, a report, landings receipt, describing how much they caught and what it was worth. Those records should be very, very complete to adequately capture the full fishing activity in the state of California, at least the commercial activity. And then we are also trying to combine that data set. So we're analyzing that data set independently to kind of get broad trends on how things are changing spatially and through time in California. And we're attaching to that this other data set that I mentioned. It's the Vessel Monitoring System, or VMS. It's basically a GPS system for commercial fishing vessels that fish for groundfish. So any commercial fishing vessel that fishes for groundfish in federal waters is required to have this. It sends a ping approximately every hour and has some information about where the boat is and how fast it's moving. And we can use that information along with the name of the boat to try to link that back to these landings receipts to try to get a sense of where fishing activity is happening based on the speed of the vessel. If it's moving very slowly, it's more likely to be fishing. If it's moving very quickly, it's not likely to be fishing. So we can help, we can use that data to try to identify where fishing activity is happening. Those are the primary data sets that we are using. We're also working now with partners at NOAA that have some observer data. Some of these vessels also have observers on board, basically people who are paid to monitor record what these vessels are catching and where. And so at least in some cases, when we've been able to combine these data sets to look at the observer data and look at our VMS data, at least for the groundfish, that seems to match really well. There are some additional logbook data. We do not have access to those things, so we have not been able to integrate that yet. But my understanding is that some folks at NOAA are starting to think about trying to put all of these data sets together, which would be really, really great to be able to combine all this information. And again, right now our focus is primarily on groundfish, since it seems like that's the majority of the activity that's happening in these areas. Again, they're in federal waters, and so all of these vessels are required to have this vessel monitoring system. And so we're right now in the process of evaluating just how complete that data set is. So that's the kind of the state of our art at the moment. And Andrea, I'm not sure if there's anything else that I missed that you want to add.
I think you pretty much covered it. I did note there was a question that also noted some of the large migratory fish that really ply the oceans will be affected too, tuna, swordfish, and so on. But I think it's also important to note that they are less place-based. They do move over much larger areas, and I think that falls in may need to be some adjustments of where fishing takes place. But I don't really think it would be a net loss of fisheries ability habitat.
And the other key feature about those species specifically, we think about these highly migratory species, things that move around, they are often following very distinct features in the ocean. That there's a front between cold water and warm water. Those fronts move around, the fish follow them. So sort of, at some times those fronts may be in a drift into a wind farm, and then it would be hard to go catch them. But at some point, that front will move outside the wind farm, and the fish will probably follow them. We also do know that if you stick something out in the ocean, a large floating object, fish tend to go to those things. We call those fish aggregation devices, or FADs. So fish like stuff that's floating out in the water, and so very often, if you hang around the edge of some floating stuff, often you'll find more fish there than you would just sort of picking a random spot in the ocean. So again, like Andrew said, these fisheries that are more mobile, wherever you put something, there's going to be an impact at some point in time, but it's really unlikely that impact is going to be long and sustained. Whereas the bottom fish that are often more associated with specific features on the bottom, certainly there's going to be some area where, okay, there were some fish here, hopefully not that many, but this area is going to be close to fish.
Thank you.
At least some sorts of fish.
I appreciate that. I appreciate it from both of you. We're going to turn a little bit to other species in the ocean. Andrea, maybe we could start with you. What is the current understanding of marine wildlife impacts in different regions where offshore wind turbines could be installed? And is there variance? What would an optimal monitoring strategy be once turbines are operational?
The $64,000 or $64 million question. You need to have a good handle on what species are in your area, species of concern, particularly those that are endangered and so on. And you do need to have monitoring systems that follow up afterwards, after installation, that use the same methodology so you can see if there really is a change. This is really hard to do though. The natural variability of these systems, especially under climate change where the baseline's shifting anyway, makes it really, really difficult to say this population before was affected is now different than the population after. But by honing in on what those particular mechanisms of potential harm might be, you have a better chance of understanding. As Ben said, you will get fish and their predators aggregating around wind platforms. Are there risks to those animals when they're there? Those are the kinds of questions I think we have to ask. And offshore, we have to adapt our monitoring methods using much more technology, way fewer people. When you have either inshore fisheries or land-based wind, there are pretty, I would say, relatively easy ways to go about this. Boat-based, observers. In the case of land-based wind, they pick up dead birds around the turbines. We can't do these things at sea. So I know my lab and many of the other national labs and universities are working on technologies that will detect animals that are in vicinity of the platforms, and particularly flying animals that are in vicinity of the turbines. Can we understand what these kinds of collisions will look like? So I think we are going to have to develop new monitoring approaches and strategies than we've had before, using much more technology based. But we cannot simply measure populations before, measure populations after, and create a cause and effect kind of relationship. We have to be kind of smart about how we do this. That's kind of generalized, I realize. But.
Thank you, Andrea. I appreciate that. Arne, did you want to add on to that?
No, I didn't have anything for that.
Okay.
So let me just say one additional thing, Andrea. I feel like we're tag teaming here. And in some ways we actually have an amazing opportunity. As Arne said, there are 1% of the offshore wind capacity is floating, and most of those have not instituted really robust monitoring programs. So like Andrea said, adding some automated systems, things like video cameras and artificial intelligence, the ability to detect these things remotely, we have the opportunity to develop the monitoring protocols to understand what the impacts are, right? We don't know anywhere what these impacts are. And so in some ways, Jordan, you talked about trying to set the gold standard for how to do this. We have this opportunity now that whenever the first project goes in the water, wherever that is, however that is, I think those of us would all advocate that every one of these turbines is bristling with scientific instruments to monitor everything from conditions in oceanographic conditions to how the wind dynamics are changing, and things like hydrophones to be able to detect marine mammals nearby, cameras to detect seabirds, even things that none of us have thought of right now, and to have a really, really robust system of data collection so that we can actually answer these questions the right way the first time. And maybe the impacts are more severe, maybe they're less severe. And if they're more severe, that will help us make the next one that much better. Again, like this idea that we can start a project and use this as a model to develop this the right way that can really become the standard for how everyone in the United States does this really everywhere across the world, and look to California to say, here's how you do this and collect this information the right way.
Terrific. Thank you, Ben. Appreciate that. Next, we have a question distinguishing. We've been focusing obviously on the floating offshore wind projects proposed in federal waters. There are two smaller projects proposed off of Santa Barbara, and basically the question about how the floating technology, I have a question from Amy Wolf from Monterey Bay. How does the floating technology proposed for the two smaller offshore wind projects off of Santa Barbara compare to the utility scale projects proposed in federal waters? Would these 12 megawatt floating turbines compare to the utility scale floating turbines further offshore in terms of technology? What about their environmental impacts, and what expected transferable lessons or information from this proposed project could be taken? Arne?
I don't know. How close inshore are these?
They-
Arne probably knows. I know nothing.
They're fairly close to shore. They're in state waters, and so state waters are within 3 miles of shore. And so I think that the difference between those projects and the projects in federal waters that are further offshore, the primary difference is how close they are to shore. I think there may be some specifics around the particular floating platform design or the size of the turbines, but I think that those differences, well, it's hard to make the comparison because the ones that are further offshore haven't yet selected a platform type or a turbine size. But I think really the big difference is how close they are to shore. And that has several implications. One is that seabird and marine mammal and fisheries populations are really different, and often typically much denser closer to shore. Different species, but also greater numbers when you're much closer to shore. And so I would expect that there are significantly different environmental concerns for the turbines that are close to shore than ones that are further from shore. And I think probably Ben and Andrea will have things to add to that. I think the other difference has to do with the visual dimension of it. When something, a big device in the water that's 3 miles from shore is going to look a lot different than something that is 20 to 30 miles from shore in terms of what you see. And so to the degree that there are concerns about visual impact, there will be a significant difference that way as well. The other difference is that perhaps that they are smaller projects, so they have fewer turbines than you might expect for the other developments, and therefore the onshore infrastructure that's needed is also smaller than would be needed for what are expected to be larger build outs in the designated call areas in federal waters. And I'll pass it over to Ben and Andrea in no particular order, however the two of you want to add to that.
I mean, Arne, you have it exactly right. Anything closer to shore is, especially within 3 nautical miles, is likely to have much denser biota there. Different species, as Arne said. We will get some of the terrestrial species that go out and fish and come back. That'll include things like marbled murrelet. I think you have them down here. That's our bugbear up north. They are a terrestrial species, but they feed out of the marine environment. They go up to 5 miles offshore. So it's just figuring out who's there, as it were. What are the risks? And therefore, what kind of important mitigation or studies have to happen. I will say that the smaller projects, in that sense, as Arne says, simply take up less space. My guess is they might not have as big turbines either. I don't know. The tendency right now is to go to very big turbines because it costs so much to put the one platform out there. You might as well kind of capitalize on the amount of power. But otherwise, it's not really any different. It's just the location and who happens to be there.
Yeah, and when we think about, when I then talked a little before about, having these things bristling with instruments and giving us a really great opportunity to develop some of these monitorings. This is that opportunity, right? In a small project that's going to have 3 or 4 turbines, it's close to shore, it's much more easily accessible. We'll be able to service equipment a whole lot more readily, something that's 3 miles off the coast than something that's 20 to 25 or 40. And so that really gives us that opportunity to start to develop some of that workflow to collect that critical scientific information that we're going to need. And having it on a relatively small project with only a couple of turbines is a great opportunity. As far as fishing impacts to that project inshore, because it's in state waters, very often the data that we have, especially the VMS, the GPS, really high resolution spatial data, does not go into that area. And so we've actually had conversations trying to figure out ways if we can use the data set that we have to come up with some estimate of the fishing activity in this area. And we concluded that because it's in state waters and much of the activity there is not monitored by these data sets, the information that we have is simply inadequate to estimate the fishing activity there. So we're going to have to come up with some other way to estimate that fishing activity there. But again, that's for a small inshore project. That's not, we're going to have obviously much different issues much further offshore. But again, it gives us this great opportunity to develop that pathway to understand what those impacts are.
Great, and I'll just jump in to note that, and Jennifer Maddox applied in the chat to note that these projects are snugged up right against the 3 nautical mile boundary, but the State Lands Commission is the lead for considering those proposals. If you want to find out more information about the state water projects, you can go to the State Lands Commission website and pull more information. There has been extensive discussion about whether the information is or is not transferable and kind of differentiating between the different data sets based on the different technologies. So I encourage if anyone specifically wants to learn more about the state projects to delve in more there. I'd love to now turn for a second to the job side. First, a general question. Could you comment on who installs the system, who owns and maintains the system, and how can fishermen benefit from this new industry? So if we can first just talk about generally, basically the labor structure associated with these new developments, and then the specific linkages to basically fishermen as well as potential alternative livelihoods. And Arne, would it be okay if I started with you?
Sure. And I'll say that I know something about this, but it's not central to my expertise. But in terms of thinking about jobs, it's important to think about the offshore portion, but it's just as important to think about the onshore portion of these systems from a jobs perspective, going all the way back up the supply chain to the building and assembly of the systems. And so the job creation will, I think, include a large number of union-based and trades-oriented types of jobs. That will be the number of jobs that we can created in the state will be larger if we build out, if we invest in building the supply chain and manufacturing capability in state rather than having to import some of those parts. Initially, I think a lot of those things would be imported, but I think that there's a real opportunity to invest in building out that supply chain so that it becomes something that is a West Coast industry. And so I think that's something a decision that could be made, and moving early to invest in that in California, I think could be beneficial to the state. I think there will be a number of port-oriented jobs associated with assembly and deployment of these sorts of technologies. And there'll be some degree of operation and maintenance related jobs as well. There'll be engineering jobs. There'll be jobs in the related to environmental monitoring. There'll be jobs associated with that will be quite specialized in terms of underwater welding and a whole range of things that combine traditional trade skills with being able to operate in a very particular environment, and then lots of ancillary economic benefits across the economy just associated with that economic. So it'll create restaurant jobs too, for example.
If I could just add that I think we're all aware that land-based wind turbine technicians are a very fast-growing sector. They can't train them fast enough. Offshore wind on the whole needs 20 to 40% more maintenance than land-based wind. So there is a lot of maintenance that follows the installation of these turbines. It's one of the reasons why going with these very big turbines is attractive, because you go out and you maintain one turbine instead of several for the same power. So that is likely to be a very large increase. We're seeing that in Europe. We're seeing the European Commission put significant funds into training and safety aspects and so on, just of the wind technicians that go from the boats to the turbines and back. It's a very big thing there in their supply chain. The other thing is, somebody asked about fishing jobs. I can only comment again from the North Sea, where they've had they're approaching 20 years of bottom-based turbines in the water. And we have seen significant fisheries jobs turn over or be augmented by these kinds of, if not the straight maintenance jobs, at least the ferrying of crew back and forth. So it's been a pretty significant thing, both in the north of the UK and also in Belgium and Netherlands and Germany for that matter. So I think that it's going to be a little painful getting that supply chain really up and running, because we don't have a lot of key parts of it, but that there is the opportunity to make this a really robust industry on this coast.
Thank you, Andrea. I will take a quick note. There was a question earlier on about someone who had heard on NPR about a federal law restricting ships, what ships can move equipment. That's a reference to the Jones Act. The Jones Act requires that goods shipped between U.S. ports must be shipped on U.S. built and operated vessels. So this is a significant restriction when you consider the size of the turbines and our limitation of domestic ships that can do that. So I just wanted to clarify that. With that, we are coming to the close of the session. There are many more questions to be answered through the chat function, through Q&A, etc. I think I would just like to, on behalf of all of us, say I think all of us, we have different perspectives on some things. We have different areas of expertise and different things that we're focused on. But I think anyone on this session would be happy to engage in follow-up conversations. All of our information is publicly available, and we're happy to send it out afterwards. So please feel free to reach out if you have any follow-up questions for any of us. With that, I want to extend my thanks to everyone for the presentations, to all of our speakers for the presentations, and to all the participants for joining. And I would turn it back over to Lita.
Thank you very much, Jordan, and thank you, Arne and Ben and Andrea. And we're thankful for the support or the sponsorship of Assemblymember Chiu for this science and technology briefing on the knowledge state of offshore wind and the challenges and opportunities for our state as we move forward. This event has been recorded and will be posted on our website for anyone to view after this event. We're very grateful also to the California Council on Science and Technology for our partnership in bringing science to policymakers. Please stay in touch. And if you have any questions, let us know. A reminder that we also have a newsletter that you can sign up for and get more news about events like this. Kia Bibi at the Ocean Science Trust leads this program, and her email address will be visible shortly. And thank you very much for joining us today.